Today what I want to do is I want to introduce to you about a project that we're doing. It's a movie room and a multi-purpose room at the Pakistani embassy. And the ambassador wanted us to build a great movie room that they could also have other events in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about how we're going to approach this project. First through modeling the software before we actually go to the work site and actually do the final acoustic adjustments and measurements. Here at the Pakistani embassy, you can see this is the rendering that we've done of what we hope it'll look like in the future. Okay, and this is the floor plan, and here we have the measurements. The room is about 13 meters by 13 meters, and the ceiling is 3.6 meters high. So those are the dimensions of the room. Now, because the dimensions of the room are a little bit challenging, there's a couple big challenges. One is all the walls are parallel. Okay, and the floor and the ceiling are parallel. Another one is there's windows along the side of the room, as you can see by the curtains that are covering the windows. And it's also a perfect square, 13 meters by 13 meters. So that means there's going to be a lot of interference waves. Now, how the interference waves work is that when the waves meet each other, basically a sound at a certain frequency hits a wall and comes back, and it meets at another wave out of phase, they'll cancel each other out, making that particular frequency at that particular position lower in terms of sound pressure level than it might be at another location. This will happen as all of the sound waves interact with each other as they bounce off the walls. You also have the opposite, where basically you could have in-phase interactions where a wave will reach another wave and they'll both hit at the high point, which will make that sound pressure level at that particular frequency in that location sound much louder. Okay. Now, when you're watching a movie or you're listening to music, when it was recorded in the recording studio and mastered, it was probably done in a very controlled condition where maybe all the frequencies didn't vary more than plus or minus 3 decibels. However, when you're in a location like this one that we're doing, there might be much bigger variances. So when you're hearing certain frequencies, you might hear it in a specific position. You might sound a lot louder at a certain frequency or much lower at a certain frequency. So your experience of the movie or the music that you're listening to is going to be very different than what you would have listened to in the recording studio or what the original recording engineers or artists had intended for you to hear. So the acoustics has a huge impact on how you experience the music, whether you experience it more similarly to what it was intended or whether the influence of the environment has a huge impact, and that can either make it, often makes it sound much worse than what it was intended to sound like. As we get to we look at the floor plan, what we're going to do is we're going to take the floor plan and we're going to put it into some acoustic software, and we're going to try to model this and see if we can come up with a plan for where to locate the speakers, particularly the subwoofers, because the low frequencies will be the biggest issue in this room. Now, if we had the option to do this project from scratch where we could build the room, we would of course play around with the dimensions of the room. And the better the dimensions, that you can see that in this purple area, the better the dimensions of the room, the less you're going to have problems with these interferences, and that'll give you a much smoother sound curve. So what we want is obviously a smooth sound curve within plus or minus 3 decibels, which you can see here. Basically, this is a good example of a plus or minus 3 decibel sound pressure curve. That's very unlikely in this environment, but when the sound engineer was engineering the sound, he was probably doing it in an environment that had this, right? We're going to probably have much higher, potentially as high as 10 or 15 plus or 10 or 15 or plus or minus 10 or 20 decibels, which is not ideal, but we're going to try to get it as flat as possible through this method. But if you had the opportunity to have a perfect listening environment, you would first get the dimensions of the room right, and then that would reduce the amount of interference of the waves. So here we have a little quick video you can see, and this is where, imagine these 2 points are different speakers, and they're releasing sound, and then those sounds are interacting. They're either canceling or they're adding up and making the sound either higher or lower at certain frequencies in certain positions in the room. right? And so we want to try to model this and try to be aware of it before we actually go into the room and figure out the final position of the speakers and do the final adjustments to the acoustics. But another thing to think about when you're modeling this is all the different frequencies, right? Our subwoofers and our speakers are designed to go from 20 hertz all the way up to 20,000 hertz. So all of those waves have different lengths, right, at the speed of sound. And so each different length of wave is going to interact and bounce off the walls at a different time. So here you can see there's each quarter wavelength. We have a full wavelength here, and that's what it looks like. And so some of the longer waves might not even fit into the room. You know, if you're going to go down to 10 hertz or something, it won't be able to fit in a 13-meter room. Whereas perhaps a 100 hertz wave or 50 hertz wave would be able to fit into the room quite easily. So here we have a wavelength by frequency graph, and you can see 20 hertz is a 17-meter wavelength, 40 hertz is a 8.5 meter wavelength, and so on. And these wavelengths are all, again, bouncing off the walls at different times and then interacting with each other, canceling or adding up throughout the room. So basically the room's going to look like this all over the place, where you have waves either adding or canceling at different locations. So you can see in the middle of the room where the two red lines are coming down, that would be where this particular frequency is canceling, and you're going to hear that frequency at the very minimum at that location where those two red lines are down here. Whereas if you look at the ends of the sides of the room where the red lines are up here at that frequency, you'll be able to hear that frequency much louder at the sides. So again, that's just sort of what it's going to look like at all the different frequencies as they interact with each other throughout the room. And of course, as I mentioned, this is our goal, which is to try to get all the frequencies to be within a very similar sound pressure level from 20 hertz all the way up to 20,000 hertz. So let's see how we actually can model this using software. This is actually a room simulator, and if you notice here in the room simulator, we have the length, width, and height of the room, right? 13 meters by 13 meters and 3.6 meters height, okay? And here I'm just going to model the subwoofers because we're going to be more focused on this part, perhaps from 20 hertz to 100 hertz or 80 to 120 hertz. And we're going to try to flatten out as much as possible, and we'll worry about treating the higher frequencies with other solutions. But first we need to worry about the lower frequencies. So here you can see that we have subwoofer 1 and subwoofer 2. And we've put them in the corners, and then we have the listening position here. So what we're going to try to do is figure out where the listener will be. We mentioned there will be a VIP section, so that'll be somewhere around here. And we want to try to get this response curve, particularly to 80 hertz, as flat as possible. And we can do that by moving the subs around. And as you notice, we move the subs around, you have different peaks and different troughs that appear depending on where the subwoofers are because of the time it takes for those frequencies to bounce off the wall and interact with the other frequencies from the other subwoofer. So again, we can model here looking for the flattest possible response. Some people like to put it in the corners. That's one way of doing it. You can put them at the midpoints of the wall, here and here, okay? And so there's different ways of putting it, but what ultimately we'll do is where we actually go to the work site and we'll move the subwoofers around and measure it on site until we find the flattest response curve in the lower frequency ranges. But first we can just model it out. And then another way we can also make it a little bit flatter is to time align the speakers with the subs, and you notice that gets a little bit flatter, and then we try to find just the right positions, and that's looking a little bit better. But you can see it's not perfect. Like the best solution is not to just put it in the corners, but it's always going to be a little bit asymmetrical. It's always going to be a little bit not exactly what you thought, and you have to just go with what the room tells you, okay? But as you notice, it doesn't matter where we move the sub, there's always this peak here around 26 hertz. So 26 hertz is going to be a problem. And of course, depending on where the listener is, they'll have different problems as well. So you'll see that the listener position also affects what they hear. So each position will have a different experience with the sound, as well as the subwoofers and where you place them will affect the different frequency responses. So these are things that we want to consider when we're doing the acoustics of any project. But again, the goal is to try to get the flattest response curve so people can experience the sound the way that it was intended by the original engineer.